As we set up this program, we wanted to bring in wisdom from the African diaspora, and actually there's some of that wisdom woven throughout the report. I think that's a good place to kick off today. Yeah, so just recognizing kind of where we are in the context of this country. Just wanted to bring in some inspiration from Adinkra principles, which are principles from West African regions that speak to the kind of diversity, unity of all people. And these are some that we picked out, in sessions that we worked on the report, and that have been woven throughout this work. So the first principle is Sankofa, and that's an image of like a bird facing backwards while it's got an egg in its mouth. So that's about the importance of remembering the past while still moving forward. So particularly for people of African heritage, like the painful past of European colonialism still plays out in the present day. So we do have to, acknowledge that and work with that in mind in order to meaningfully move forward. The second principle is Nyama Baribi Wo Sorrow, which is a call to hope and inspiration. So we know that this nature of work can be really difficult, but we still remain hopeful for change. And also we're inspired by the amazing work of our peers and the folks already in this space, already doing fantastic stuff. And then the final principle is Nkonsen, which represents a chain link. So this represents the strength of unity and connectedness. So driving racial equity, it does need all of us, and the fruits of this labour will benefit all of us as well. So I just wanted to invite us to sort of take a quiet moment before we dive in, just to actually let those principles settle. So I was going to invite us just to take 3 rounds of breath together as a collective, and with each breath in and out, just focusing on one of these principles on the inhale and exhale. So firstly, inhale, reflecting on Sankofa and the importance of reflecting on the pain as well as the triumph that has come before us in order to help us carve a path forward. Second breath, connecting with hope and inspiration and the great work that is already happening. And thirdly, third breath, recognizing the strength that comes from all of us actually being here, being connected in our efforts and being connected to this wider movement towards justice. And just letting those principles settle in and guide us throughout this conversation and throughout the work. Great. So yeah, as we dive in, I want to position this conversation, about racial equity in youth counselling and sort of therapeutic support more broadly within the current context that we're in the UK. We just saw the biggest far-right march in our nation's history. And I think for many folks, this might feel like a new threat, like, oh, where's this come from? But actually for racialized communities in this country, actually feels really familiar and quite unsurprising. And the reason for that being that this country has a really long history as an empire, right? As a colonizing force all over the world. And there were a lot of atrocities committed as part of that. And the transatlantic slave trade being one really foundational example, and the sort of foundation for the systems that we still suffer under. So how does a people justify its role in, atrocities like that? Well, it creates a framework in which it can justify them. And so racism was born. Race never existed as a concept without a hierarchy, and that hierarchy being white supremacy. And it was designed specifically to justify, that project of enslavement and theft of African people and their descendants. I'm just going to let that sit. And then I'm just going to row back a little bit. What has this got to do, this sort of distant, if you want to, I don't think it's that distant, but, this history, what's that got to do with youth counselling now and mental health support now? What's it got to do with me right now, this, light-skinned Scouser sort of given this lecture? Well, so for me, I'm descended from some of those African people that would have been enslaved in the Caribbean. And at some point in the 1800s, some of them, like many, came to Liverpool. And that was like, we've been 4 generations in Liverpool, so sort of 5 generations from those ancestors in the Caribbean. And this is where we start to see like the really sneaky and quite determined nature of racism, because 5 generations feels like a fair amount of time to get established in a place, right? But actually for me, I'm very seldom accepted as being like actually from here. People always want to know where I'm really from. And then on the other hand, 5 generations is only 5 goes. It's only 5 attempts at healing, and healing from something very horrific. And so there is fallout. There are challenges at each generation. And so racism plays out, yes, in the everyday experiences of being racialized as Black or brown or other somehow, and the ways that those identities were leveraged to justify violence. But it also comes with this ancestral legacy and the intergenerational impact of those really violent roots. So I just want to name those different ways that racism plays out that we've tried to speak to in this report. And we see that in the mental health system. I know Kim's going to speak a bit more to this, but specifically why we wanted to focus this work on Black and people of mixed Black heritage is because of some of the massive discrepancies we see specifically for that group in the mental health system. Massive discrepancies in terms of diagnosis of, particularly psychosis and schizophrenia. Much more, significantly more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. For Black young people, there's this real adultification, being treated as adults when they're actually children or young people, and being sort of punished accordingly, with issues that really should be treated like mental health or neurodivergence or trauma responses, actually just being punished and escalated, whether that be from school exclusions all the way through to prison sentences. And then we've got this therapeutic model, which is all about the one-to-one, and the individual, when actually what we have is a collective experience, it's a collective trauma, and it's not in the past, it's ongoing. So this report, it talks about those sort of deep roots. We've used the whole tree analogy. That's another thing to know about me, is I'm a nature nerd, but we talk about deep roots and rotten fruits, because actually we can't look at anybody's mental health without looking at the historical and the political and the social, cultural context for that. So I didn't want to approach this with like a diversity and inclusion hat on, how can we get more diverse, more Black and brown young people into these services? How can we get them included? But actually approaching it through a decolonial lens. So how do we offer support that actually appreciates the ongoing impact of that colonial legacy and actively tries to dismantle the harms that are still ongoing as a result of that? So I worked with 4 partners. So Youth Access have hosted this work, they've commissioned this work, and they've worked with 4 members, also 4 organisations, some of which are in the Youth Access membership. So there's 42nd Street in Manchester. I can see some of them here today. Thank you guys. And there's practitioners and young people from these services as well who are absolutely brilliant. So 42nd Street and their project for Black young men, which is called Jet 42, absolutely gorgeous. Off the Record in Bristol and their project Zazie, which again caters to young people of the global majority. There's Corrie Youth Service in London, and there's Laurie on the panel who's going to speak to their work as well. And then there's Black Psychotherapy. Kim's also on the panel. They're a virtual service and also with a service in Brixton in London. So yeah, the report deep dives into some of those problems that I've highlighted and that sort of rotten tree, but it does also highlight really amazing practice, really amazing practitioners, and great ideas from young people that can really be expanded actually quite easily. So it's not about reinventing the wheel, it's about tapping into wisdom that's already there. It's about remembering practices that already existed in cultures, despite and actually in the face of efforts to repress them. So we just need more of us to come together to expand work like that. So with that, I will pass over to our first panelist, Kim Lolia, who is the founder and CEO of Black Psychotherapy. And they're going to tell us a bit more about how and why Black Psychotherapy came about and how you do things differently and really brilliantly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cara, and thank you to the Youth Access team. Firstly, apologies if there's any background noise. I'm in the office today. We're based in Brixton and it's quite lively. So if you hear any music in the background, apologies for that. So I'll start with sharing some context, as that is a really helpful part of decolonising mental health and decolonising practice. We were born really out of my private practice. I'm a trauma psychotherapist and often worked in the communities that I also exist in as a Black person, but also as a queer person and as a genderqueer person, as someone who's got chronic illness. So I kind of hold quite a lot of marginalized identities within me, in my body, in my world. And I was working with clients who were telling me that they, had to kind of choose between whether they took their Blackness to therapy or whether they took their queerness or their neurodivergence or any other aspect of their identity to therapy. And to me, that seemed not at all what therapy is and should be, given that it's supposed to be a space that is really holistic, that is a space where we can be met as who we are and be known as that, and the space where we can even interrogate our identity and cultural context in a very nuanced way. So out of that kind of rage and out of that frustration, I then created Black Psychotherapy as a space that's exploring what does it mean to, first of all, support entirely Black and global majority communities. And within that, how do we build a real deep understanding of cultural competency, what that looks like in practice, and how we support others to also build that in how we supervise, in how we train, and in all aspects of our work. Cara, would you like me to share a little bit about other aspects? Yeah, I'll keep going. Okay, cool. So as part of the work that we've done with Youth Access, we're particularly concerned about, what does cultural competency look like, and how do we start to implement that across our service, but also across our practice and also our lives. So we're having these kind of concentric circles with our practice being intimately connected with who we are and how we show up in the world. And it really starts for me and for us as a service, it starts with decentering the individual and starting to really center the systemic, and to speak on that, and to bring that into practice, and to name the impact of racism and as racial trauma, as trauma that shows up in the body, in the mind, in the nervous system. So a lot of our clients, when they come into the service, tell us that maybe they've had anxiety, depression, various other interpersonal traumatic events and traumatic incidents. And hearing the experience that they've had of services and of therapy, it's very much been about them, that kind of hyper focus on the individual, what they've done, perhaps like inviting them to work through their anxiety by using tools and techniques, and engaging with their feelings, and all of that is absolutely okay. But what's being missed is the fact that their anxiety could also be linked to a lived experience of trauma that is racialized. And what it means, in the last few weeks, for example, we've had clients who have been really afraid navigating public transport to come to therapy. We've also had team members who have been really afraid navigating public transport or spaces in general in the public sphere. So it's never just about the anxiety coming from that particular thing or that particular personality trait. It's way beyond that. And then in terms of how we're supporting people, we need to broaden that gaze beyond what we've learned in our training. So, I mean, my training is very much kind of anchored in Western psychotherapy, as is, the training that many of my colleagues have had. And I've had to also expand that. I've trained as an African-centered therapist and practitioner, and have an additional diploma in that. But it's not, not that there's a privilege there, and not everyone can do that. But it is really about not assuming that we have all the tools that we need, or that the tools that we have are even appropriate to the folks that we're supporting. And that's very much come out of the report, is that kind of tension between our lived experience and our pain, and the fact that the tools that we're being offered are typically not at all culturally meaningful, culturally attuned, empathic, and they tend to be one size fits all. So that's where we're seeing these colonial dominant scripts also play out in the therapy room. And there are lots of examples of that. We're also really exploring, how do we move towards a future where therapy is no longer needed in its current form? So embracing a more abolitionist framework, because therapy typically comes from a very Eurocentric context. And in many cultures, I mean, they've existed for millennia without Western therapy as a model. So if we moved away from that, what would we do? Would we build deeper networks of community support? Would we build more group spaces where we can process our feelings, not assuming that kind of one-to-one is appropriate for everyone, because it isn't. And within an African-centered context, that kind of one-to-one frame is sometimes a very foreign thing, and it can feel really unsafe to even go into that space and talk to someone without your community. So it's really about having to reimagine therapy in its broader sense, in a general movement towards liberation, and also towards, I think for us as practitioners, becoming really honest about who we are and who we want to be, and the kind of support that we can offer and what that looks like. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'll hand over.
Thanks so much, Kim. Laurie, do you want to pick up from there? So good to hear, Kim, about some of those different methodologies and the importance of responding to the actual experiences, and cultural lineages of folks. Laurie, do you want to introduce yourself,
Yeah.
and share a little bit about your reflections on this work?
Yes. Hello, everyone. So my name is Laurie, and I have a very interesting perspective. I have a sort of dual perspective and role and a dual lens on this work, in that I came into contact with Cara and the Youth Access Network, both as a young person who had my own experiences of mental health challenges, experiences of mental health system and psychiatric services, but also as a current practitioner of youth wellbeing support for young people actively in an organization called CORI. Now, I grew up going to CORI. So I grew up as a young person benefiting from a service that really centered young Black and Brown children. CORI was started in 2002 by African and Caribbean storytellers, artists, and musicians who were at the time working in schools and really seeing the disparity in attainment. This was in the early 2000s, so some of those statistics and figures were sort of coming out in a real way, and they wanted to do something about it. So using the sort of Saturday school model, although for us it was on a Wednesday, we would have once a week youth work sessions where we would explore, I always said it was an issue and a art form. So through creativity, whether this be music, painting, photography, trips, environmental learning, we would be exploring some kind of issue or topic, usually generated by the group themselves. And this is the way we continue to work today. Today, I can speak as a program manager at Corrie. We have three main programs. Our first program deals very much with well-being and socialization of young people, as we're seeing, and you can see this in the report, a lot of the young people coming our way. And I'm sure I saw many youth support workers and counselors in the service who I'm sure will be nodding along with me here in terms of isolation, challenges leaving the house for young people, challenges socializing with other young people. So our first program, Not My Label, really speaks to this. And in doing so, we offer young people opportunities to expand their range of experiences through trips, activities, workshops, meet and socialize with other young people, and really build their sense of both self-confidence, general sense of well-being, and sort of prime them up with a set of goals and aspirations that they might have for themselves. This then takes us into our next program, which is called Blooming Minds, which is all about skills development and training. I call it the kitchen. If our first program is the living room where they get to know us and we get to know young people, Blooming Minds is very much the kitchen where they're picking up a really particular skill that they have highlighted that they want for themselves. So in this way, with Blooming Minds and all our programs, really, a key basis of our work is working in partnership. So we do a lot at Corrie. We're very culturally competent. We're very culturally aware. We're very curious about cultures with which we might not know as much. But one of the things we really recognize is that we can't do it all. It's impossible. No one organization can do it all. And again, this method of singular solo working can be very important, but also very challenging and harmful, because in that way where, you know, community partnerships and building partnerships across other organizations, we've certainly seen expand the range of what we can offer young people on the ground. So that's a real big aspect of our work. So Blooming Minds, young people might generate goals and skills for themselves, find skills, find training. A question in the development of Corrie over the years, a question then occurred to our founder. We had cohorts of young people who had had input from a very young age, had built their confidence and well-being, and had a sense of what they wanted to do and had training about it. And the question was, where do these young people go next? And the answer that she found was that, well, we go back home. We go to Africa, of course. My background is Caribbean. I came from the Windrush generation on both sides, both a Caribbean heritage and Irish heritage. So all sets of grandparents came in the 1950s. But of course, we're all part of the African diaspora. And so, yes, the answer was to go back to Africa. And so what we did was we developed our program, The Vessel, which essentially supports individuals with a certain set of skills or idea of something they want to do and takes them through an international project development training program with the view of them then delivering this program with a partner organizations that we would have developed in a different country across the continent. So far, we've worked in Kenya, Tanzania, and Gambia. And then currently, as of right now, we have a team in Namibia doing a project there. So that was a very big overview of what we do at Corrie, but I think some key things that I found both as a young person at Corrie that really benefited me in both some difficulties I had as a young child, experiences of bullying, experiences of being one of very few people of color in a very white school. I went to school in a very white area. And later on in my adolescence and early 20s, when I was dealing a lot with mental health, key things were the power of the third space, the power of a space that wasn't my home and wasn't this academic sphere where I could socialize with other young Black people of color. That was essential for me in terms of my self-identity, forming the basis of my confidence in my heritage and my history. And I see this work still carried through with young people today. So the power of the third space, I think, is so important. I should say as well, at Corrie, whilst our focus and our experience is still very much working with the African diaspora, over the years, the 23 years of us working as an organization, we found that working with young people across different diasporas, South Asian communities, just global majority communities in general, because a lot of the problems that we're talking about are affected in nuanced and different ways. But the work that we do in things like the power of the third space, the power of having trusted adults who are curious about young people's experience and wanting to support, that remains true, I've seen across all those communities. I think key things that stood out to me when reading the report and reflecting on our work at Corrie was this idea of cultural attunement I keep talking about with our staff. Um, and key ways in which I think we meet this at Corrie is both, as it outlines in the report, having highly trained staff. Now, that training comes in the form of more formal approaches, but also there's usually a current understanding of lived experience, either lived experience as a racialized person or lived experience of racialized communities. I know Cassie's going to go on to talk a little bit about this, but we have uh, staff at Corrie who come from all different backgrounds, racial backgrounds as well, but there's a shared understanding of living and working and being together in racialized communities that sort of acts as an undercurrent, I think, to our workers staff. Another aspect of this is what we know, what we have in our lived experience and what we have in our training we have. But I think a key thing is curiosity and the understanding with young people that we're not always going to get it right. We might ask a question that goes a bit left. We might assume knowledge somewhere that we actually don't. But I think the most powerful thing I've seen with young people is very much approaching them as fellow human beings, you know, with us as staff just having been around a little bit longer, but generally approaching people with the same level of respect, curiosity, and care that we want to across our staff, across our team, across our communities in general. So yeah, I think cultural attunement, curiosity, and that dance between youth support worker and young person, between staff member and staff member, is an ongoing practice within our organization. I'm just gonna, Cara, do a little time check on how much I've been talking. Am I good to go on, or shall I leave it there?
I think if you can have a couple more minutes, Laurie.
Oh yeah, okay. um, so I'll finish out by saying I think one of the last things I'll say about the report that really stood out to me was the idea of decolonial spaces as opposed to diverse and inclusive spaces. Because I think there is a subtle nuance between those, as much as we're all speaking about diversity and inclusion. Unfortunately, there's a lot of speaking against diversity and inclusion these days, but I do think this idea that rather than making a space, so for example with services these days, it's often the case that young people are asked to fit the mold of a service, whether that be through the duration of time that the young person might require support, the 6-week model of support, whether it's falling into a certain age bracket or a borough bracket or a, you know, how many young people I see who cannot access a brilliant service in this borough over here because they happen to be born in the wrong borough and have no way of moving. It's often the case that parents and young people are quite surprised when I tell them that we work 11 to 25. So if a young person comes in at 11, they can stay until they're 25 if they want to. And I think it's all things like this, stepping away from colonial ideas of time or the process or a linear sort of healing journey. And the more time young people can have to engage with a service, disengage with a service, and come back. Because as we all know, the road to healing is not linear. It's often meandering and often flowing as a river does. So I think, yes, the centering of how much can we as organizations question the colonial structures that are embedded, even in very conscious, even in very you know, community-centered and focused organizations. How can we really embed this idea of decolonial practice in our work? I think that's something that really interests me, and I'd love to see where we go with this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laurie. There we go. Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to reflect on that holistic approach. That's something that really stood out to me about Corey, you know, and O'Deary, who was the founder and leads Corey, like just being a real expert in so many different fields, whatever it takes to respond to that young person's needs at the time, whether it's suddenly becoming a bit of an expert in immigration law or, you know, housing law. And I know that will resonate with a lot of the youth access membership that is here, you know, being that sort of one-stop shop approach. I also just wanted to highlight what you spoke about, the power of being with young Black or mixed people or global majority people to develop that identity. And I have to just speak to the work of the guys at Jet 42 in 42nd Street in Manchester, because they're a really pivotal part of this project. It's nice to see some of your faces here today. And just the power of young Black men having a space to be together, to be held, to validate each other, to build relationships that are so supportive, with the support of two role models, Black men, you know, that are not trained in all complicated kinds of therapy, that there is youth practitioners and, you know, peers and you know, fellow Black men. It's absolutely beautiful. It's an absolutely gorgeous space that's decolonial in very simple ways. So I just have to say, like, props to that while Laurie was speaking to that subject. But yeah, on the subject of great youth access members, I'll hand over to Cassie, who's the CEO of Youth Access, and can speak a little bit to your experiences, Cassie, of bringing this work together as well.
Thanks so much. It's good to see some familiar names and faces here. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know us, Youth Access National Membership Network for Youth Advice and Counselling Services. So our members are local organisations really rooted in their local communities, supporting young people aged 11 to 25, as you say, with pretty much anything they've got going on in their lives, really. And I wanted to say thank you to Cara, Kim, Laurie, and the other young people and practitioners involved from 42nd Street and from OTR Bristol for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and your insight that have been so vital to this project. I wanted to say that, you know, as a white leader, I think it's really important that we recognise that there are things that can get in the way of us doing this work. You know, feelings of discomfort or defensiveness, potentially, fear of saying the wrong thing or of not being able to do it all, so kind of getting paralysed and not doing anything. And it's important to acknowledge those feelings so that they don't stop us from making progress. Like, I don't get it right all the time by any means, and I'm not holding myself or Youth Access up by any stretch of the imagination as kind of perfect examples, but it's better to show up, to make a mistake and learn from it, than to be silent, because silence really is complicity with the status quo. And I think if you read this report, if you speak to Black young people, if you read the headlines, I don't think there's any way that any of us can say that the status quo is okay or acceptable. I also think that a barrier can be, you know, work on racial equity being seen as kind of an add-on or really specialist. And of course, you know, we have some really specialist skills and people showing with us today, or being seen as like too political or maybe not relevant, maybe because there's not, you know, a large Black population in the community, but that can often make it, you know, even more important that those young people have space and community to connect to. And I think we're all here, we're all doing our jobs, and our organisations exist because we want all young people to thrive. And if we want to be successful achieving that, we can't ignore the historical, social and political context that young people are growing up in. So this really is, you know, core to the work that we're all doing. I don't have lived experience of racism, and I don't want to take up too much of the space today. But I do also recognise that as a white leader, I hold a lot of power and privilege. It's important that we're visible and that we don't leave this work to our colleagues from racialised communities who are feeling the impact of racism and oppression, all the time, and for whom there is real emotional labour involved in trying to change the system. And to go back to the Adinkra, one of the Adinkra principles that Cara shared around strength in unity, we all benefit from creating a more just world. We all have a stake in that and a share in that, and it's important that we play our part. The good news is that, so as Ibn said, we're not starting from scratch. So I wanted just to briefly touch on some of the fertile ground and the recommendations that are in the report. Some members of Youth Access, like 42nd Street and OTR Bristol, who were involved in the project, are already doing, loads of proactive work in this space. And for those who aren't yet, the values and principles that Youth Access members have are a really great starting point. Those ideas and principles that are really embedded in the work that you do around building trust with young people, like thinking beyond the therapy room to holistic approaches, psychosocial models of support, and flexible approaches are already built into your approach. So that's a really great foundation. We have to say something about funding, because all these conversations always have to say something about funding, because it is really hard. And the report sets out that there's an important role for funders and commissioners to centre racial equity in the work they're doing. And we set out a couple of areas where we're particularly keen to see funding, so to support training and to support that kind of community building and networks for practitioners. That said, there is a lot that we can do, as Cara's already said, or suggested, without additional resources. As the report sets out, and as you've heard from Kim and Laurie, there is an existing depth of knowledge and expertise and resources, in communities themselves, but also in organisations. So the rest of us, it's there, to learn from, and we have to kind of commit to the time and energy to doing that and making it a priority. And the report also sets out how organisations can make progress on staffing and organisational culture, getting involved in collective action and the importance of that, and meaningfully supporting young people to be change makers in themselves. And again, that kind of holistic approach, getting away from the individual. So I will just finish by encouraging you to please use the time today to explore and commit to what your next step might be, wherever you are on this journey, at whatever point you're at. At Youth Access, this project builds on work we've done previously, community of practice on racially responsive services, and some other pieces of work. We're also recently consulted on a quality framework for Youth Access members for youth advice and counselling services, and that includes accessibility, equity, and anti-oppressive practice as a really core element that we would expect all services to have, and that sets out sort of what high quality looks like, how you might measure it, what some of the tensions and challenges would be. So as we go into shaping our next steps and priorities, and particularly thinking about how we can best support services to improve in this area, please do tell us what support would be most useful to do that. As you're thinking about what your next steps are, please let us know how we might be able to support that as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cassie. Yeah, and really great to see so many Youth Access members here. And thank you, Cassie, for speaking to that, with vulnerability, to speaking to those challenges that can be faced, that discomfort that comes up. We can't get through this by trying to stay comfortable, we can't change things trying to stay comfortable. So we do need to equip ourselves to be able to have, difficult conversations and build the tools that we need in order to do that. And with a lot of therapists in the room, hopefully, we'll be able to do that. This should be the best community for that, right? We've got a few minutes to just answer any questions, if there's questions coming up, whether that be clarifying questions or reflections, anything specific for any members of the panel. I'm not seeing anything in the chat so far. You've all been quite shy, but if anyone's got a question, there should be an option at the bottom of the screen to use the raise hand function. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Oh, I can see something in the chat.
Just to say, Christine, that we'll pop the link into the chat in a bit to the full report so that you can access it easily.
Yeah, it's called Growing Racial Equity, a co-created review of what works for Black young people.
Right, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Hello, I can't find my raised hand thing, so I'm just going to speak. So obviously, Jet 42, 42nd Street were very instrumental in this report. The young people who come to Jet 42 every week, and for anyone who doesn't know, Jet 42 is a space for young Black men to meet and connect, and we do this by way of having the essential conversations that it's not always possible to have with our peers, with our parents, with our co-workers, etc. It's a non-judgmental space, and we've gone from strength to strength since conception, to be fair. We are there for young people to sort of develop better coping strategies and help seeking behaviors, and to be sharper, wiser individuals as a result of contact with the group. Now, one of the things, and you'll know this, Cara, that the young people were really keen on was next steps. That's something that came up a lot in conversations. There was even a little bit of frustration from a couple of members who said, well, we've been asked these questions before, we've been here before, we've had these conversations, but where does it go next, and how together can we elevate this? How can we get this to the people who need to hear it? And we know, obviously, there's a current climate out there which isn't exactly friendly to these type of projects. I can see a lot of DEI kind of speak over here. It's not just in America where they're talking about it. There's a situation where it looks like we could have Nigel Farage in charge of the country in a few years' time, and I'm sure it'll be even more difficult for voices like ours to be heard within that. So it's just a reflection, really, and kind of question as to how can we go forward? Funding's more difficult for all companies, all organizations at the moment. People are getting the funding taken away from them. People are losing staff members. So, how do we've got a few people here, how do we go forward, and how do we make it so that the next time we see each other, it isn't sort of 6 months or 12 months time, and there's been kind of no advancement since then.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric, for putting that on the table, because it's so important that this isn't just another report that sits on a shelf and doesn't, drive anything. And we are actually going to go into breakout rooms in a few minutes as well to bring out more of that in the discussion, to see, well, what would help drive this forward in organisations or for practitioners, and what might hold organisations or individuals back as well. But actually, Kim, could I ask you to maybe speak to, what does it take to get an organisation like Black Psychotherapy off the ground and do the work that you do in a way that, that is decolonial and everything against, the odds, really?
Thanks, Cara. Yeah, sure. So it is a lot of hard work, and at the same time, it really needs to be values led. There's that, in me anyway, and in the leadership that I provide to the team, I'm constantly in that inquiry of, am I aligned with my values? Am I practicing my values day to day? Are they everywhere? Can you see them everywhere? And it's that kind of coherence that I think builds a lot of safety for our clients who have a sense of who we are, who have a sense of what we can provide. But also within that, it's that permission to say, I actually am seeing this particular aspect of my practice or the service that isn't quite cutting it, or it's not quite reaching cultural attunement, I need to do something, and that empowerment to keep growing. But yeah, there's also something about risk tolerance as well, being okay with, you know, people potentially being unhappy with what you're saying, having to really, you know, and it's linked to the values as well, but understanding that there will be resistance, there will be pushback. I often get asked, you know, why is it that you run a service that is entirely for Black and global majority people? Why don't you work with everyone? That's a constant conversation that I have with people, and that opens up another conversation around, okay, let's talk about the context and why that's actually needed. And, you know, our experience of our clients coming in and saying that they've been traumatized seeing white therapists. That's why we exist. Now, of course, in, you know, some other future, maybe we won't need to exist, but for now, it's absolutely essential. And there needs to be some kind of confidence and an ability to say no, that we need this. This is really important for us and our communities.
Thank you so much, Kim. I also wanted to just put that to Cassie as well, and sort of, you know, because youth access has been putting racial equity, you know, on the agenda, you know, on its organizational agenda, as a strategic priority. I just wonder how you keep it there. How do you keep it as a central focal point?
Thanks, Cara. I think for me, it really comes down to, like, what is your purpose as a charity? Like, how do we connect the work on racial equity to the reason we exist as an organization and why we're doing our jobs? And then it's a question of how we create accountability mechanisms. So driving equity is one of, you know, 3 strategic goals for youth access, that guides everything that we do. And I think there's always, I mean, we had a discussion, you know, when we set the strategy, and it's a conversation that comes up in this kind of work all the time, is like, oh, but it's relevant to everything, so it should just be like mainstreamed across all the other goals. But we felt really strongly that actually having it as a really explicit strategic goal in and of its own right, although obviously of course it stretches over other areas, was really important. And so because it's in our strategy, we're publicly accountable for it. It's in our kind of business plan reporting. We also created a lead trustee for equity on our board, who is here somewhere, I think, in the audience. So I have quarterly meetings with her. So as the CEO, I have to report to her every quarter about progress we're making on that area of our strategy. It's on every board agenda. Every meeting there's an update, so that I can really be held accountable for the work that we're doing in this area.
Thanks so much, Cassie. Really great points about how to actually integrate that accountability into every sort of layer. I can see a hand raised from Michael. Did you have a question, Michael?
Hey, hi everyone. Hello, hi, how are you? Now, thanks for this. This sounds like a very, very intriguing adventure, and I think the report is the step in the right direction. But sort of a quick question. What sort of input would you like from other, say, older minority groups that have gone through what you guys are going through and need like help the younger generations go through whatever they're going through and maybe come out from the other side? So I sort of summarize the question really. What sort of input would you want from older people in the minority groups that could be maybe helpful for you guys going forward?
From older people?
Like I assume I'm an older person, right? So I'm thinking that in terms of the younger generation. So what will, as the younger generations doing this kind of work, what sort of input would you want from older people from the similar group?
What sort of impact from older people who?
Yeah, so I don't know. It's about involvement. The question is like, how do we get involved to make sure that we're hands-on and we are taking the right steps in the right direction, make sure the younger generation don't struggle like we, the people who are older, have gone through.
Yeah, got you. Got yeah.
I
Okay.
think what Michael was saying is that as an older generation, what can we do to support the younger generation so they don't actually go through the same attacks, the same racisms? I think it's more like when your young child will come and tell you they've experienced racism at school. I think Michael's saying, how do we stop that and work together now?
Yeah.
To ensure that the younger generations don't actually experience all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah. Does anyone on the panel want to speak to what we can do? What older generations can do? I don't know, Laurie, maybe if as a younger person, how do you see the importance of that intergenerational approach?
Well, this is the word I was going to use very much so. I think embedding intergenerational work and practice in your organizations, and I think creating one of the steps for us at our most prosperous as an organization and most spread, we would generate different groups. So outside of the 3 programs that I spoke about, we might generate gendered groups or a third space group, a third gendered group, for example. We'd also develop maybe experience specific groups, so things like for people who are recent citizens or young migrants. But then we would also develop spaces and places for intergenerational groups. So whether that be through community meals, or young people would be doing cooking workshops and developing meals for older residents within the estates that we were based in. For older people, I think it's very much, if I could say anything for something that really benefited me when working with older people, it was again this dance and this give and take of knowledge and experience, because I think the older generations have so much to offer young people in terms of the experiences that they've gone through, the context that they've came from, the time that things, how things were. But I think also having that balance, we as an organization always try to make sure we have younger people within our leadership teams and much older people within our leadership teams as well. And the at best discussions, at worst frustrations between those 2 groups, and the dialogue between those 2 groups, I think is really important. So I think it's how we generate dialogue for both the experience of what comes before, very much Sankofa, but also the experiences of what's happening now and the ways in which young people push our thinking forward in the same way that older people, I think, very much expand our thinking and the depth of experience and wisdom in the room.
Thank you so much, Laurie. That was a great response. Lots of thought
Can
there.
I just say as well, it's important to have that.
Really brief, Eric, because I want to go to breakout rooms.
It's really important to have those intergenerational conversations. I think that, for instance, young people might have seen a very different type of racism, the sort of like endemic structural racism, and the racism we've kind of going back to now. Us older types are more used to that, and maybe it's about sharing those experiences and highlighting what's actually going on when we see it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I could, it's very evident the value that the lads in Jeff 42 get from being able to get that support from you guys who've been through a lot of this stuff, before. Kim, Cassie, did you have any good conversations in your group?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a little bit about the group that I was in, which was people really reflecting that coming along today, and really gave them a lot of prompts to think about, and really recognizing that actually their organizations aren't doing much or enough, and that there's still a long way to go, but being really committed to raising that in their organizations and trying to think about ways in which that they can really kind of push their organization to do more to better serve their local communities. I think a sense of that, a subject, once you start learning about it, you realize how little you know, and how much kind of space there is to move, but not being overwhelmed and thinking about the steps that can be taken.
Yeah, not being overwhelmed, just get started. Kim, you were in a group with folks feeling a bit more confident. What did you hear back?
I was, yeah. And as I joined a little bit late, inviting folks who are in my group to come in and feel free to share their thoughts because I might have missed something. But I guess one key takeaway from that space was that there needs to be some sense of safety within the culture of the workplace, within the culture of the service, and the difference that it can make to be able to whistleblow and receive support, care, understanding, not to be shut down, and these examples between workplaces where perhaps it has been done with care and with safety, and the difference that then makes to everybody, and the work as well that is then possible because of that, and other contexts where there's more institutional oppression going on, where, you know, when concerns are raised, it's shut down. That creates lack of safety, that then undermines, you know, the work and the entire structure of the organization. So that is definitely a big thing that we were talking about.
Thank you. And I wonder actually then if Cassie or Kim, you want to pose any questions to the other groups about what they discussed. Is there anything in particular that you'd like to hear back?
Yeah, so one of the areas where I'm really interested is how do we actually relate to each other differently because of the work that we're doing? We're really talking about building decolonial principles, but what does that mean in terms of our relationships, how we line manage, how we learn together, what happens when we make mistakes, how we navigate those emotions. So maybe it's because I'm a therapist, but like that's very much my kind of area of fascination. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd really, welcome. And of course, there's no right answer. So any thoughts are welcome.
Was there anything from any of the breakout group discussions about, those working relationships, how you work together in ways that embody these values of racial equity and decoloniality?
I just want to say quickly, if I may, I think it's already well and good, and I think a lot of the organisations who are here today are really strong in favour of this. But I think, for instance, if we're still dealing with companies that are literally white at the top and black at the bottom, it's, there's only so much change you can have if there's no decision makers. There is a problem recruiting practitioners, black practitioners, global majority practitioners, particularly black male. I think there needs to be changes there, because someone said in our breakout room, if I'm the only, this isn't me, but someone said, if I'm the only black person in the organization and I'm line managed by someone who might not actually understand the work I do or who I actually am, that there are the issues abound. So I think there needs to be, more collaborative working on our side, and we need to push this agenda so it's not just, so it doesn't become a tick box exercise, because that's a bit of a big hate, that tick box exercise which doesn't go anywhere, because we're not the decision makers. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see going forward.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to go to your colleague Angeli. If you can keep it brief, guys, and then I'm going to just wrap up so we finish roughly on time.
Yes, we'll be as succinct as possible. Can you hear us?
Yeah, hi, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Eric. So we were just discussing whether or not, just going forward in terms of keeping this kind of like momentum going and keeping this conversation going, is there an opportunity for a community of practice, whether it be nationally or something that could be done in different regions? What are the conversations happening around there, around that from Youth Access's point of view, or is it something we can put in place ourselves when we talk about partnership work? Because it was something that came up in our breakout room from the lady from the NHS. I can't remember her name. Catherine. Yes.
If Catherine is still here.
And that's it.
Thank you so much, Angeli. And I'm sensing that appetite, isn't it? That it's in the report. I know we're hearing it over and over again to keep these conversations live. I know the Black Psychotherapy offers a bunch of different spaces for practice development for therapists. Kim, maybe you want to really briefly just speak to that, and we are also sharing the links for everybody as well.
Yeah. I'll keep it super brief. So yeah, we do have more formalized training that we deliver around decolonizing mental health, decolonizing practice, what that looks like in very sort of tangible terms. But we do also have lots of kind of communities of practice that are emerging around how we implement justice-based principles into our work, and how, you know, how do we do partnership working? What happens when we disagree? What happens when, you know, somebody might be further along in their learning compared to someone else? And how do we stay connected? We need these lab spaces. We literally need to go and practice these skills, because I feel like without that, we're not going to move forward. So yeah, you're all very welcome to connect to us. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, so feel free to get in touch.
Thanks, Kim. Cassie, I don't know if you want to speak to that really briefly as well.
Yeah, so we have a number of networks at Youth Access. None of them are specifically in this area, but it's definitely something if members want to explore that. And I'm really interested, kind of touching on what Kim said, is how do we do that in a way which feels safe for people to be involved? What does that look like? What does that look like if Youth Access hosted it, or if we supported Black Psychotherapy to do it? I think there are a number of different models we could explore in terms of what people would find most kind of useful, meaningful, and psychologically safe.
Amazing.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much to the panel, and to Cassie, Kim and Laurie for taking the time to speak to everyone today. Thank you so much to the organisations who've been involved, Eric, Angeli, Samson, the team over there at 42nd Street, and all the lads. I know there's some of them here today as well from Jeff 42, and also to Off the Record in Bristol, and the young people that took part there. If anyone wants to pop in the chat as you say bye, just also any of the commitments that you took away, if you want to share them in the chat, that might be a really nice way just to check out as everyone leaves. But thank you everyone for your time today. Martha's going to pop in the chat all the links so that you can stay in touch with each organisation, and obviously so that you can get the full report as well. So please do make sure that you have a read of that, share it with your peers, share it with your colleagues. Youth Access is going to be doing a bunch more promo over the course of October, Black History Month, sharing this, so please do look out for it, reshare, use the month to initiate conversations at your organisation. It's a really good opportunity at the moment just to drive that conversation forward. So thank you all and have a good afternoon.
You as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you
Take
very
care,
much.
everybody. Thank you. Oh, did you just...
Thanks, everyone.